In case anyone was wondering, this is a graphic of shipping density that was created by the Department of Global Studies at Hofstra University. So for me, context is really important, and I think this map reveals something about our geopolitical assumptions when we think about trade, and that is transport and access. The last time I was invited to be on call, I spoke about BRICS and the TPP and the intersection between trade and militarization. And the narrative at that time was that the Obama administration was undermining the potential for BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa cooperation. Since that call, both Brazil and South Africa have undergone U.S.-backed regime change of their democratically elected presidents from these sort of trumped-up corruption charges. This administration has also been heavily courting India's Prime Minister Modi to participate in the Quad, a containment policy involving Australia, Japan, and the U.S., and it now promoting a platform that seeks to literally co-opt the China-led Belt and Road Initiative. And while this is all happening, both China and Russia are being painted as autocratic villains and cheaters, despite their tremendous popularity at home and among the non-aligned countries. And even though Trump pulled the U.S. out of the TPP, the military and containment agenda is still very present. And so before I talk about the Belt and Road, I do want to quickly reframe the backstory, which is important in order for us to understand the context. Next slide, please. So after what I generically call the 2008 financial collapse of the neoliberal system, the US, EU, Japan, and most of the other advanced economies had a rude awakening, namely that Wall Street's debt and investment paradigm across all sectors had collapsed and a government bailout was necessary to revive the economy. By 2010, it became apparent that although there was an impact on the emerging economies, for the most part, the state ownership system of the BRICS economies were still viable and seemingly quite sustainable. I think for the U.S., the failures of neoliberalism is one of too much debt and not enough equity. And if we were living in the immediate post-perestroika world of the Clinton-Bush era, where there was only one viable economic power, or what I prefer to call a unipolar system, then too much debt and not enough equity would simply be the only system. However, that paradigm is as fantastical as Donald Duck, and as much as we wish we could hold these Disney-fied half-truths to be self-evident, the whole truth is very different. Next slide, please. So these three charts tell a different story about our national economy, one that I think is maybe a bit more realistic than the overly optimistic numbers that Wall Street provides. And I think in many ways it's sort of a good continuation from where Celeste left off. But chart A measures our public debt to GDP. And I want to highlight the period of growth after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the Washington Consensus that gave us that neoliberal doctrine in 1989, and that is the vertical blue line. And then the 2008 financial collapse, which is the vertical red line. For the advanced economies, the prudent debt limit is 60% debt to GDP with a threshold limit of 90%. Where we are now for the United States is at 106%, which is around $21 trillion of debt. For developing countries, the prudent debt limit is 40% with a debt threshold limit to 60%. And so just for contrast, since 1998, China's public debt has generally remained around the 40% mark. Chart B details the debt after 2008. The blue line represents the debt with quantitative easing measured against nominal GDP. That is represented by the green line. You can barely make it out. The red line, which you can see is the money supply, which is technically called M2, but also includes liquid assets like savings, CDs, money markets accounts. And the increase, that very slight increase that you see is seigniorage, or the printing of more money into the monetary base. Now chart C, which lines up to Celeste, is the net international investment position measured by a country's balance of payments. It specifically addresses foreign direct investment inflows and outflows. So for the U.S., this payment deficit means that we import more goods and services and capital than we export, and we must borrow from other countries to pay for our imports. Hence, our debt pays for consumption instead of investing in future growth. And I think this is perhaps where I might have a disagreement with Celeste in terms of where the money comes from in order to pay for our debt. So in the big picture, global investors may generally be less interested in propping up high debt countries like the U.S. and prefer a multipolar system that is more equitable in terms of commodity markets and have better returns for investments of goods and services. So obviously there is much more to this story, which I will touch on later, but right now you might be asking, well, if this were true, then why then do business with the U.S.? And even the U.S. does have a service. There is a service that the U.S. provides, and I think it's quite fair to say that the U.S. is a mercenary country that can sidestep international law simply because we have not ratified a lot of agreements. If the Senate had ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or Protocols 1 and 2 of the Geneva Convention, or the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, then we might not, be going around the world behaving with such impunity. Next slide, please. So where we are and where we have been for the last decade is in this global economic realignment that is taking place within the G20. The G20 being the 20 largest economies that include both the advanced economies and the emerging economies, who for the most part are aligned with the developing countries. In terms of the international rules of trade and investment, the G20 is really one of the most important forums. Now, in 2009, when Obama joined the TPP, it was fairly clear that creating this trade cooperation was primarily a bully agenda to try to force open China's market. Foreign investment in China had already exacted a lot of damage to the environmental and health standards, and this is something that only recently has China been able to curtail and in some cases reverse. Next slide, please. So here's a before and after picture of a hugely successful reclamation project called the Huangtu, or Last Plateau. This was an ambitious project sponsored by the World Bank and China, impacting area about the size of Texas. And anyone interested should familiarize themselves with this project because the scale of this was so vast and so successful that it made me realize that the world could actually potentially reverse global warming. Next slide, please. So in terms of BRICS, what China did was to work with the other emerging economies whose debt thresholds were healthy and relatively stable. In 2014, the leaders signed the Fortaleza Declaration. It's a binding declaration that led to the creation of new multipolar financial institutions like the New Development Bank and the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, alternatives to the World Bank and the IMF. And at its inception, it is a brilliant read because it is a declaration committed to moving away from the unipolarity of the Washington Wall Street agenda and return further back to the multipolar, multilateral UN system. Under BRICS, international development and finance, has been decentralized with institutions in China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The BRICS understood that they could more comprehensively meet the development needs of the various regions than the unipolar development banks that resided in Washington. So after the Fortaleza Declaration was signed, the TPP countries really ramped up their containment policy. So, for example, after Obama launched the Asia-Pacific Rebalance or the Pacific Pivot, Japan changed to Article 9 of their constitution, removing the self-defense clause to allow for more aggressive military campaigns beyond their borders. We also began to see a greater emphasis directed against both China and Russia, particularly around the issue of the South China Sea, which hopefully could be another presentation because that is an issue that is fraught with so much information that it should just be simply classified as a conspiracy. Next slide, please. So whatever you think you might know about the U.S.-led freedom of navigation, it is not dissimilar to the doctrine of expansionism that we find in the Monroe Doctrine. The freedom of navigation has always been a really vague policy intersecting commercial maritime rights with what British Foreign Minister Grey called belligerent rights. And this policy is made even more convoluted considering that China has never impeded in shipping lanes. There have been skirmishes over fishing rights and exploration licenses all around the South China Seas, but those conflicts involve all the countries in the region, not just China. The international law that you often hear about China breaking is also kind of a bogus court case taking place without China's presence in the International Court of Arbitrations. And the rules used in this case was not the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, nor the UN Commission on International Trade Law, the governing bodies that are most often tasked with resolving these kinds of disputes. The rules used were other, quote-unquote other. In what world is other a rule for international jurisprudence, right? So for the U.S., the objective is only to undermine the China-ASEAN Agreement on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, which is the rightful regional jurisdiction for resolution dispute so that it can impose its own vague commercial rights with belligerent rights. Earlier this month, right after the CPTPP was signed, hardly a week went by before Japan met with Malaysia, Australia met with Vietnam to further undermine the China-ASEAN Agreement. Additionally, the U.S. and Japan just engaged in war games in the South China Sea with their nuclear aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, and Trump has expanded the Asia-Pacific rebalance to be the Indo-Pacific region called the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which will include the regions between Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights other places where there are destabilization efforts. Next slide, please. Sorry, I missed the last slide, I think. So this slide are other destabilization efforts. You have Yemen, Ukraine, Syria, Somalia. These are relatively new conflicts that arose after BRICS. And in North Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, those are all transit points linking the Belt and Road Initiative. With North Korea, the initiative it's China's access to the East Sea. So I'm just going to come, right out and say it, that the Belt and Road may very well be the most ambitious development and investment project in the history of the world. And the full court press against China and Russia in both the mainstream and independent media, and this includes many progressive and conservative outlets, reminds me of the witches in Macbeth, speaking absurd incantations all in unison. Next slide, please. So it may be typical of the propaganda machine to spew half-truths, except they are the most powerful and utterly wicked because these incantations are essentially preparing us for war. And there is little we can do about it because the same democratic processes that have put Trump in the White House are the same processes that are providing the overall consent for war. So if you step back, really our journalists are writing double, double, toil and trouble, Putin and she and boil and bubble, or eye of newt and toe of frog, belt and road and tongue of dog. And if it sounds insane, it is. There is no space to actually look at what the objectives are for fair and equitable trade and what globalization justice should mean among and between the advanced economies, the emerging economies, developing countries, particularly in the context of climate change. Even in the Facebook Trade and Globalization Justice Group that many of us here are part of, I'll sometimes provide, some viable non-journalistic evidence, meaning primary documents like treaties, conventions, congressional reports, agreements, etc. None of it really seems to matter. I just end up being called, a Chinophile or Russophile, and this is mostly true in regard to the Russian annexation of Crimea and the disputed territory around the South China Sea. I mean, the point is that these silly journalistic incantations have very real-world consequences, which to me is so crazy because the story of Macbeth is all about ambition and power. And the lessons of its failures have been taught in schools and performed on stages for hundreds of years. So how, as a nation, have we become as gullible as Macbeth when much of the world understands what is happening and in my opinion is really just waiting for the madness to implode. There's something wrong when the discourse is so meticulously orchestrated as to remove the voice of actual sanity. Next slide, please. Earlier this week, the Diplomat magazine published an article called Redefining the Belt and Road Initiative. They write, the Belt and Road Initiative is not a route, but a smart power strategy which aims to wrap the entire world, not only Eurasia and Africa, but also Latin America. The problem with this kind of analysis is that it's not like China or the Belt and Road Initiative is cutting in line to be the next unipolar world power. The reality is that the U.S. steps out of the line. On the one hand, the U.S. could simply not afford to lead the world as it had, and on the other hand, Trump has literally pulled the U.S. out of the line when he pulled the U.S. out of its international commitments. One thing that is not often discussed is that if the U.S. cannot afford to buy it, to buy what it breaks, it cannot afford to lead the world the way that it did. During the post-war and Cold War years, the U.S. had the capacity to prop up and maintain regime change, but I'm not sure we can afford to do that today. In the case of Honduras, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, I have my doubts whether these U.S.-backed governments will survive a legitimate democratic election, simply because the neoliberal free market privatization schemes are just so damned unpopular. My sense is that this string of coups may well be temporary salves, impediments to slow down the rate with which the world is moving away from unipolar neoliberal policy. If we look at a more extreme perspective, the ever-expanding presidential kill lists and the ongoing destabilization efforts around the world, and I would include our own national context as we saw yesterday in the March for Our Lives protest, the weapons industry has simply created an environment where all we're doing is facilitating a market for guns and security. Our objectives are clearly not designed to stabilize regions with fair and equitable economic policies. All we are doing is fueling the flames of instability. Jeremy Scales reporting over the last few years of how instability is being managed by U.S. secret armies and private military contractors should be self-evident by now to everyone on this call, but the question of why this is being done might not be. Next slide, please. I keep returning to these geographical trade routes because these are the access points for transport. So when we consider that the Silk Road began over 2,000 years ago, I mean, it's not actually even really about the Silk Road, but when we realize that the history of supply chains go back to, the birth of civilization to some degree, maybe we can understand just how historical supply chains informs our geopolitical narrative. For thousands of years, caravans trading across virtually all landscapes provided a level of exchange in markets that grew into multicultural centers where culture, language, and belief systems mixed. But it was the emergence of the European-dominated maritime trade in the 16th century that displaced the land-based transport of goods, and many of the old centers of trade were sidelined when populations moved to centers with maritime access. As colonial powers competed for domination, islands became strategic locales for controlling maritime trade and transit points since they were easy to defend and administer. The technological shift from land to sea advanced the social and economic growth of maritime regions while stagnating innovation and commerce along the land-based routes. So the implications for the Belt and Road are not only confined to the Eurasian landmass, but to Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And as I mentioned before, the U.S. has gone full court press against China's ambitions. And it's important to be clear that what is at stake is clean, renewable energy, smart power, smart transport, next generation 5G telecom, education, health, food security, labor mobility, big data, artificial intelligence, information technology, robotics, all of these, new technologies, many of them even to help with climate change. So, all of these sectors are right now, or will soon be, subject to international agreements and conventions, and that is what is at the heart of these agreements. Are assurances for fair and equitable trade. So when you step back away from the chatter, it's easy to see what countries have ratified what conventions and treaties and what countries haven't. So, when you're looking at what countries have ratified and what haven't, under this rubric of reality, whatever glimmer of light one might think the U.S. possesses, much of the world shines much brighter because, much of the world has signed on to these conventions and treaties, Next slide, please. So it is within, this context that the Belt and Road Initiative steps to the front of the line, altering the geopolitical map. The point is that sustainable, equitable trade does not have to be an oxymoron, and we just have to adjust to that concept, not lead it, not co-opt it, not undermine it, but participate in it in a way that is fair and equitable and ecologically sustainable. The Belt and Road provides that opportunity, and I can say that with some conviction simply because what is written in the Fortaleza Declaration and in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank's Articles of Agreement are binding commitments to conform with international standards. These are legal documents, and when you consider that World War I was essentially a war waged as a result of broken treaties, we cannot trivialize these agreements. They are not like throwaway opinions concocted by journalists, generating fear and mistrust, no matter how many times it gets repeated. What is happening now with the Belt and Road Initiative is that it is being harmonized with the real development needs from regions and countries that understand their fragility most. And this is what Xi Jinping has been calling win-win. Next slide, please. So, it is we who have to flip the bias of war and engage in this new initiative. We need to ensure that there are checks and balances, appropriate dispute settlements that conform to ILO labor standards, health and environmental standards that can hold corporations, industries, and states accountable. We need a binding mechanism for free, prior, and informed consent. We need global tax reform, a venue to break monopoly power. We need to radically embrace renewable energy, and we need to have the ability to enforce compliance and monitoring across all these sectors. I mean, the laundry list of must-dos are already taking place with a lot of civil society organizations in regional and multilateral conferences. There are so many sectors that we could excel in, but we are not progressing with the kind of infrastructure that the world wants or needs. Next slide, please. Last slide, please. So as new regions of the world are shifting toward more meaningful global change, why are more of us not at the table? It is as if some of the advanced economies want to undermine and sabotage sincere attempts to build a 21st century global economy that is in line with the Sustainable Development Goals that a couple of people have mentioned. Why is it so important? Only to ensure that our neoliberal financial institutions and corporate legal structures continue to lead the way. Power has an expiration date and it's long past. And I think that is the real lesson of the 2016 election. As it is now, there are a lot of regulatory rules attached to multilateral agreements that many of the participating countries in the Belt and Road have already signed on to. What has been holding the world back is really the United States. And until the witches stop their silly incantations and revise the nonsensical narrative and actually begin to embrace a model of peace and equitable sustainability, we're only going to end up perpetuating our destructive paradigm. Thank you very much.